of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, we know that the sheer scale of the killing and the destruction that Israel wreaked on Gaza during Operation Cast Lead was something that we haven't seen in many decades. We know that Israel deliberately targeted civilians according to those reports. We know that a UN-run school that was clearly marked was targeted, killing dozens of Palestinian civilians when there was no Hamas fire coming out from anywhere from near it. We know that the Red Cross was banned from going into Gaza by the Israeli military for a while, and then when they were eventually let in, they had found several Palestinian children who were starving, who were too weak to stand up on their feet, who had been laying there next to the corpses of their dead mothers, causing the Red Cross to issue a criticism of Israel, which is something that it usually avoids. It's usually more dispassionate. We know that world media was not allowed to go into the Gaza Strip during that attack. We know that entire neighborhoods were flattened and that tens of thousands of Palestinians were left without access to clean water or running sewage. And the outcome of all of this was 1,400 Palestinians killed, at least, more than 400 of whom were children and more than 100 women. And by comparison, 13 Israelis killed during that period, which is to say more than 100 Palestinians killed for every single Israeli. But the problem here is not just proportion. Indeed, proportion is a problem. But the primary problem lies in Israel's narrative of what took place in Gaza. And that distorted narrative is that Hamas fired rockets and Israel was then forced to respond. This ignores many things, not the least of which is the fact that it was actually Israel that violated the ceasefire. If it was indeed concerned about its civilian population, all it had to do is not violate the ceasefire so that Hamas would not fire those rockets. But to understand this issue, I think it's important to look at a bit of the context in which it has occurred. Next slide, please. What you see in green is what became Israel in 1949, on a bit larger than the territory that was allocated to it by the United Nations, and at the expense of over 700,000 Palestinians who were driven out from what became Israel. But this nevertheless became the legal entity of Israel as recognized by the international community and the United Nations. Now, the remaining 22% of historic Palestine, the parts that you see in red, the big one to the right is the West Bank, the small one to the left is Gaza, are the territories that Israel illegally occupied in 1967. That occupation was immediately declared illegal by the United Nations, as it is a standard principle of international law that land cannot be acquired through force, and Israel was called on to withdraw. In 1988, the Palestinians unilaterally renounced any territorial right to 78% of historic Palestine. They endorsed the two-state solution, and they recognized Israel's existence. And that kicked off the peace process with the idea that Israel was going to gradually withdraw from the occupied territories to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state on 22% of historic Palestine. The only problem is that at the time when Israel was supposed to be withdrawing and relinquishing its occupation, it did the exact opposite. Next slide, please. Every single red dot that you see on this map, they're not too red now, but it's all the dots that you see over here, are illegal Israeli settlements that Israel had built on the occupied territories. And the number of those settlements had actually doubled during the peace process. So instead of ending its illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories, it further solidified it at a very accelerated rate. And this is why the peace process failed. Now in 2005, next slide please, Israel pulled a public relations stunt by withdrawing 8,000 illegal settlers from the Gaza Strip. Of course, at the same time, sending 14,000 settlers more into the West Bank. So in effect, the occupation was actually expanding. But it pretended that it was interested in withdrawing and relinquishing the occupation. But rather than ending the occupation of Gaza, it actually put Gaza under siege. And that siege was further tightened when Hamas came to power democratically. We heard Hamas holding the Palestinian people hostage. Apparently, bringing somebody into power democratically is what we're to take as hostage-taking. And the results of that siege were absolutely devastating. Next slide, please. What we ended up with as a result of Israel's unlawful siege, and again, I'm quoting human rights organizations and the United Nations, 50% unemployment, 80% of households dependent on UN aid. More than 260 Palestinians died due to lack of access to medical care because of Israel's blockade. And then you had the ceasefire, in June, which Israel violated on 7 different occasions in its very first week, before any Palestinian fire had come out of the Gaza Strip. But despite minor violations by both sides, the ceasefire more or less held until it was November 4th, on the day that Barack Obama was elected, when Israel launched a major offensive in Gaza, killing several Hamas members. And Hamas then responded with a barrage of rockets, which now Israel used as justification to launch its destruction of most of Gaza. To quote the executive director of Human Rights Watch, he said, in Gaza, it was a humanitarian crisis due to Israel's unlawful blockade, those are his terms, and that after Israel's assault, the situation in Gaza turned into a humanitarian catastrophe. Next slide, please. So now the narrative really that we have to look at is not so much Hamas fired rockets and Israel was forced to respond. The proper equation is that Israel had put the Palestinians under an illegal occupation. It's building illegal settlements on their territory. It's building an illegal barrier in the West Bank in violation of the International Court of Justice ruling on it. It is torturing Palestinians on a regular basis, including Palestinian minors. It has put the Gaza Strip under an unlawful siege, starving its population, and it has launched occasional bombings in the Gaza Strip, killing several Palestinians. And the Palestinians were given a choice. You can passively accept this treatment, or you can resist with any sort of violence, which then Israel would use as justification that it has to defend itself and launch even further atrocities. That's the context that the Palestinian rockets should actually be looked at in. Now, indeed, Palestinian rockets should be condemned, as is the terrorism of any oppressed population, but it should always be taken in that context of oppression. When black South Africans were setting off bombs in apartheid South Africa, the apartheid regime had 2 options. It could either further punish the black population by creating more dire conditions and by larger rates of killing, or it could end the apartheid system in favor of a solution. Hamas faces a similar option, and instead of relinquishing the occupation, instead of ending the siege and ending the apartheid system it has established in the occupied territories, it has chosen to launch further atrocities as a means of self-defense. Of course, nobody can take that seriously as self-defense in that context. And then you have the argument that the only reason why Palestinian civilians die is because Hamas uses them as human shields. To be specific, what was meant by human shields is not really human shields. What is argued is that Hamas is hiding in civilian areas, which of course is a standard tactic that is employed by military forces that are not regular when they're fighting a regional superpower. That certainly was the case for Americans fighting for independence from Britain, is that they employed guerrilla tactics and were hiding among civilians because they could not face the British army on a battlefield. But you have 2 arguments now. You have Israel's contention that it's only targeting Hamas and killing Palestinian civilians by accident. And then you have the contention of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that Israel indiscriminately bombs civilian areas. In fact, Israel, according to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, has used white phosphorus illegally so extensively in Palestinian residential areas that it was dubbed a war crime. So you can either take Israel's word, excusing its own massacres by saying that it only targeted Hamas, or you could take the more neutral sources that say that Israel had indiscriminately bombed civilians. You can make that choice. But in addition to this, there's a particular distasteful irony to the argument that Hamas uses human shields. And the reason why this is particularly distasteful, please click the next slide, is that the party that actually uses human shields in the very crude sense of carrying bodies and putting them in front of you in battle is actually Israel. This is a photo that was taken in 2004 of a 13-year-old Palestinian boy tied to the front of a military jeep during clashes. The United Nations has documented that Israel had used an 11-year-old boy during this latest Gaza invasion as a human shield. And this, of course, occurs despite a ban by the Israeli Supreme Court against this practice. You'd think that it's intuitive that you should not do this, but apparently in Israel, you need the Supreme Court to explain to you that you should not put children as human shields when you're going into battle. But to make this actually worse, the Defense Ministry in Israel contested that Supreme Court decision. One really wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry at the culture that is promoted. And ultimately, this whole argument about human shields is completely unnecessary, specifically because it is Israel that is triggering the conflict. And if it were only to end the conflict, it would no longer have to make those so-called difficult decisions that it's being forced to make.